Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, we're going to be talking about Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs for short, and the role academic publishers play in support of them. The SDGs, there are 17 of them, were developed in 2015 by the United Nations to address the effects of climate change and are expected to be met by 2030. As you might guess, academic publishers, particularly in the sciences, but also HSS, can and do play an important role in advancing our understanding, advocacy, and action with the SDGs. Ritu Dhand, Chief Scientific Officer at Springer Nature, joins me on this four-part series to talk about how the research community, and Springer Nature in particular, are driving engagement and results with the UN's SDG program. In this third episode of our series, Ritu discusses inclusive science and how Springer is executing on the concept, as well as concrete ways to engage the Global South. Okay, so I'd like to talk about the Global South for a bit. We hear a lot about how we need to involve the Global South in research publication and access. What are some of the successful initiatives for not just making research more accessible to this community, but also, including researchers from this region in the scholarly communication lifecycle?
Many of the challenges associated with the SDGs do affect non-Western nations. And in order for us to see success, we have to have those voices in the research sort of sphere, if you will. And one of the biggest problems that we have in the publishing world is that journal editorial boards and reviewer boards reflect a research landscape that existed 5 to 10 years ago when the Western nations dominated research publishing. But today, China produces the most scientific documents, followed by the US, then India, UK and Germany are in the top 5. But in the top 20, as well as other Western nations, you now have Brazil, Turkey, Korea, Iran. This was something that was not there 20 years ago. And this is change that has been in the making for the last 20 years. If you look at the countries in the G20 that have grown the most over the last 20 years, it's your non-Western nations. It's Saudi Arabia, China, India, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico. And the countries that have grown the least in research are your Western nations, UK, US, Canada, North America, the European countries. But what has changed much more recently in the last 3 to 5 years is the impact of research. So if we stay with the same example of looking at the G20 countries, 20 years ago, only the Western nations had above average world research impact. But now you see above average research impact for China, India, Turkey, Argentina, Saudi Arabia. Indeed, China's growth and impact is spectacular because not only are they producing the most research documents, but it's also the highest cited research in the world. And generically, it's comparable to the research that's coming from the European nations and North America. So this is one of the biggest reasons that people haven't seen the sort of global research landscape come to the fore. And we're, in terms of research publishing, we're still behind. The majority of our ed boards and peer reviewers are from Western nations, and they aren't familiar with the research that is coming from non-Western countries. They're not familiar with the research teams, who is doing the research, the quality of the research. And this brings in an element of unconscious bias. And Western researchers also struggle to fully understand the challenges at play globally. And perhaps more importantly, they have insufficient knowledge of local infrastructures and needs. So, research from Western nations, while it's being undertaken, isn't being published at the same level. So, to ensure that the Global South has a voice, we need to diversify our editorial boards and reviewer pools. We have to educate and raise awareness of impact, create trust and more recognition for more diverse communities. We need to support our researchers to peer review and be editors on journals, having mentorship schemes for reviewers and editors from non-Western nations. For us to really make global progress with the SDGs, it's imperative that the decision makers for what research is being published reflect the diversity of the current active wider research community.
Excellent. Can you talk about or explain what inclusive science is and how that can be executed on?
So, again, it's a little bit of a long answer because I have to tell you what we have in play currently. Most journals currently are selective. They are selective because when journals were launched in the 1900s, because of print and distribution costs, article volumes were lower. And then with the popularization of the impact factor in the 70s, most editors of journals strive for low volume journals because of the impact factor calculations. And there has become a subsequent association, wrongly, that low impact publishing is associated with higher volume publishing. And so today, most journals are selective and they cream off the top 20% of what is being published. But this has created a huge problem because while all research that is undertaken is funded, only 50% is being published. So more incremental advances, descriptive research, negative results, for example, they're not being published.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of duplication of effort, a lot of wasted funding, as researchers have to repeat everything in order to see that it didn't work, for example. Inclusive science is to publish all research that is valid and technically sound from all around the world. So inclusive journals have diverse editorial boards that reflect the research field. Because it's a new field, we can do that. They will use diverse reviewers, and all research that is technically sound is published.
Excellent. Okay, so then how does equitable OA play a role here?
This is the conflict of term that open access brings. While the research is available to all, somebody has to pay, and it's the authors this time. And we know that everyone can't support self-publishing, if you will. So we have open access agreements with a number of institutions all around the world, which means that the corresponding authors affiliated with participating institutions may be eligible to publish their articles with fees covered by the institution. And we have many hybrid journals where you can facilitate this type of publishing. We also waive fees to researchers from countries defined as low to middle income by the World Bank. We have spent over 20 million euros in waivers. We offer discounts to authors. We continue to support and grow our subscription journals for this reason. We have over 2,500 hybrid journals where you can publish both OA or the publication fee is covered by subscription costs. We own the Research Square preprint server. We acquired this because we wanted to have ownership where all researchers are encouraged to deposit their preprint of their research before they go into peer review. And this is something that would also support those researchers that are funded by Bill and Melinda Gates, where they have recently announced that they won't support APC publishing, but they will consider a deposition in a preprint server as supporting open access. And perhaps most importantly, over all our papers, we have open data declaration statements, so that wherever we publish, however it is published, the data statement is freely accessible to all.
Excellent. So then last question here, what is regional novelty? And can you talk about how that can benefit inclusive science?
As I've alluded to throughout this series of podcasts, is that to be able to be successful with the SDGs, we need to have knowledge of global challenges. And for successful implementation, we need knowledge of local infrastructure and economic resources. And this is something that Western researchers are less familiar with, unless they've been specifically trained in these areas. So, for example, publishing a water purification paper, the highest impact paper, for example, may utilize the most sophisticated technology, be very expensive to implement, require a lot of resource. And if researchers from mainly Western nations are on ed boards and the reviewers, that is where they're going to hold their bar for a high impact publication. But on a more in a developing country, let's say, for example, where there isn't that local infrastructure that will support that sophisticated technology, they need something that's actually a lot less sophisticated. They need it to be cheap. They need it to work in local surroundings, villages, places that are more remote. And these kinds of papers are unlikely to be published in our selective publishing sort of environment, which is striving for, the best technology. And more inclusive publishing ensures that all valid research, whatever the impact, can be published. But because of that, we will publish research which is needed, is considered important and valuable to less developed nations, for example. Another example would be the use of nets to fight against mosquitoes. That isn't needed in Western nations, but it is needed around the world. So that is the essence of inclusive publishing, to set up journals that have diverse ed boards, that will use diverse reviewers who are knowledgeable about local infrastructure, to make sure this type of research isn't being rejected at first base.
Right.
And as a publisher, we have a responsibility to ensure that, the research that actually is most impactful, it doesn't have to be the most technologically advanced, is promoted so that it's seen and discovered. And if you have reviewers and editors who are knowledgeable, they can advise us of this. And so we can ensure that research that they alert us to is highlighted on contact portals or press release, promoted in blogs, to ensure that it gets the discoverability that it needs.
You just heard from Ritu Dhand, Chief Scientific Officer at Springer Nature. This episode was brought to you with generous support from Springer Nature. Join us next week for our final episode of this series as Ritu talks about how Springer Nature achieved full buy-in from its employees around SDG publishing support. And with the projected completion of the UN Sustainable Development Goals a mere 5 years away, Ritu reveals whether she feels the glass is half full or half empty with the progress we've made so far. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.